Hi, class. Welcome to week 6 of the Trinity. In this lecture, we're going to talk about backgrounds to the Trinity, some theological backgrounds to the Trinity that may help you in your reading and to understand exactly why the debates are happening in the way that they were. To start with, I want to introduce you to an idea, and that is that the same authority that we invested in our early church fathers to determine the books of the Bible is the same authority with which we invest them to figure out some foundational doctrines of the church. The Bible itself does not tell us what the Bible is supposed to contain. There's no list of books within the pages of Scripture that tells us what Scripture is supposed to contain. So we have to go outside of the Bible to the traditions of the early church to determine what the acceptable books of the Bible are. The contents of Christian Scripture were finally determined at the Council of Carthage in 397 CE. But it's remarkable to note that our earliest list of accepted books, called the Muratorian Fragment, dates to about 170 CE, and it largely contains the stuff that ended up in the final list. You can see the list of books in the Muratorian Fragment here in this table, and you'll notice that only a few books, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 3rd John, are not listed in the Muratorian Fragment as books that the Church considers accepted teachings or Scripture. Now, we don't know how the various Christian churches landed on this list. We just know that somehow, some way, the church coalesced around this list in the course of trying to determine what was authoritative. We really can't peer back in time to determine the exact way that things happened. We can only observe that it happened. The church has always believed that the Spirit was present and driving the formation of the biblical canon, even though the history of how it happened is partially unknown to us, and the parts that are known to us have plenty of messy and questionable things happening within them. The same thing's true of Trinitarian doctrine. The readings in the lecture last week clue us into the fact that there had been some developments in Judaism around wisdom theology, around Memra, and concerning the multiple bodies of God, which may have served as antecedents to Trinitarian theology. However, our earliest Christian documents suggest that a Trinitarian formulation was already present and accepted in the church before those writings were generated. Just like we don't know exactly what happened to produce the list in the Muratorian Fragment, we don't know exactly what happened to cause the church to coalesce around a Trinitarian formulation. What we do know is that the same people that the church has trusted to debate and determine the canon of Scripture is the same group that has debated and developed Trinitarian doctrine, and that some form of Trinitarian doctrine has been accepted from our earliest records. Now, that doesn't mean that the path has been direct. In our reading for this week, Holmes uses the word incoherent a lot, which can mean anything ranging from chaotic chaotic and incoherent to not fully formed. I think Holmes is mostly using the term in the sense of things being a bit chaotic in those early days of Trinitarian formulation. Early Christian thinkers were definitely trying to explain Trinitarian concepts, but they struggled to do so. At the same time, concepts around Christology were being debated, which definitely fed into how the Trinity was thought of and explained. It wasn't until the Cappadocians and Augustine gathered all the loose threads into a more cohesive explanation of the Trinity that the doctrine was fully realized in a form that we'd recognize today. And remarkably, this happened about the same time as the New Testament canon being closed. The foundations of Scripture, of Christology, of Trinitarian doctrine, and even the ecclesial form of the church were all being developed simultaneously. Holmes does a pretty good job walking us through the various developments and debates that happen surrounding the Trinity, but there's a lot of back and forth to this debate, and so it does seem chaotic, even when an expert like Holmes is trying to guide us through it. Please do your best to read and understand the shape and timelines of the debates, but what I want the big takeaway to be is the following: that despite the confusion, despite the challenges, despite the fact that simpler systems were available, the church kept coming back to Trinitarian formulations as the best way to talk about God. But why was this so hard? Well, simply put, the Greek philosophical systems that the early church inherited, and that we in the Western world have also inherited at least to some extent, made thinking in terms of two powers in heaven or in Trinitarian formulations really difficult. As you'll discover in the reading for this week, Origen, in particular, who was probably the most westernized of the early fathers, struggled with how to make a Trinitarian God work with this concept of what it meant to be divine. But he didn't give up on it. He was still convinced that God was Trinity. Before we dive into infinitude, though, the first item in this list, I want to point out that all of these concepts exist in a system. It's hard to talk about divine infinitude without also talking about divine simplicity. So if the concepts at times seem to overlap, that's to be expected and okay. And it's the fact that these concepts interlock and overlap that made navigating towards a Trinitarian formulation so tricky. So let's start with divine infinity. While the church was very careful in adopting Greek philosophical ideas, they didn't do it uncritically. They were very thoughtful about it. I argue that they were still heavily influenced by these Hellenistic ideas. Specifically, they were influenced by Platonic ideals. Plato suggested that in the realm of the divine, there existed these perfect ideals for everything that we see around us, and our ability to identify an item as a chair, or a building, or a tree, or whatever, is because there was a correspondence between that thing and the ideal of that thing that lives in the divine realm. Things in creation, though, were imperfect and flawed copies of the heavenly ideals, and as a result, a common belief was that material things were fundamentally flawed and distorted images of these divine ideals. In order to describe the limits of creation, all things within creation were said to be finite. They have flaws and all sorts of nasty things that have to do with their material nature. Things in the divine realm were said to be infinite, that is to say, not finite. In ancient times, they didn't use the term infinite in the way that we do today. For something to be infinite is to be separated from the realm of creation, and as soon as it touches the boundary of material creation, it becomes finite and loses its divinity. Of course, today we don't think of infinity in this way. For us, infinity means all-encompassing. Something that's infinite but does not include some portion of something is not really infinite, right? If we have an infinite set but it doesn't include, the number 3, we say that's not really infinity, right? It's excluding something. Well, in some ways, Christology and Trinitarian doctrine are easier to explain with our modern understanding of infinity. And that's some of the work that theology does today in Trinitarian debates and other debates, is kind of rethinking terms and how to keep the fundamental ideas of the ancient world and import them into modern metaphysical paradigms. But that's not how the ancients thought about infinity. God, being the divine source of all things, was infinite. And so for Jesus to become flesh created all sorts of problems. We've talked about this in previous lectures. How could something divine enter the world of the finite? That meant losing divinity. And yet the early church maintained that Jesus, the incarnate Word, the Son of God, was divine. How is this possible? Well, Holmes walks us through how Valentinius conceived of this with his multi-tiered view of reality and how Irenaeus responded. Valentinius wished to preserve the dignity and the perfection of God the Father, and so he proposed tiers of beings and tiers of reality, each less than and subordinate to the one above it. Given the problem that divine infinity poses to the idea of divinity taking on flesh and walking among us, Valentinius was trying to propose a solution. The problem is that it stripped Jesus of his divinity in ways that the church has never affirmed. In response, Irenaeus proposed a Trinitarian formulation in which divinity could be maintained because God the Father remains distanced from the world, but reaches into the world and touches it with his 2 hands. And these 2 hands are the Son and the Spirit. These hands are a part of God and connected to God, but are able to touch the finite without transmitting that finitude into God and without their own divinity being corrupted. Irenaeus struggled at points to argue how this separation was possible, but this is largely considered the first structured attempt to describe how God exists in 3 energies. The goal, of course, is to allow God to touch the world, but to not allow God to be corrupted by finitude. So this continuing conversation of what it means for God to be infinite continued to be a struggle that they had within Trinitarian formulations. Well, Irenaeus' proto-Trinitarian description of God was problematic because it challenged another notion, which is called divine simplicity. In short, divine simplicity is that God is not made up of parts, but rather God is simply an indivisible whole. The reason that simplicity is important is to prevent other things from becoming divine on their own. For instance, we believe that God is just. But if justice is merely an attribute of God, then we would be able to appeal to justice apart from God. The same is true of God's love. If love is just an attribute of God, then perhaps love exists out there as an undiluted entity to which we can appeal rather than God himself. Divine simplicity is a way of saying that all that we understand about love and justice and peace and creativity and fatherhood or anything else is because it is fundamentally a part of God and God's character. Divine simplicity says that God is indivisible. Well, Irenaeus' formulation of God the Father working in the world with two hands, the Son and the Spirit, makes it appear that God is in three divisible parts. Irenaeus didn't seem to recognize this problem, or at least didn't address it, but it definitely came up later as a problem, and that Trinitarian solutions didn't facilitate divine simplicity. In other words, divine simplicity remained a problem in how we can articulate three persons in one God. And this is where the concept of monarchianism comes into play. We've talked about that in some previous lectures as well. With monarchianism, God the Father alone is ruler of all things, and everything else is subordinate to the Father. Lacuna touches upon this concept and reminds us that monarchy means the rule of one. The idea of monarchianism follows the rule of divine simplicity because it argues for God's oneness in ruling, his indivisibility in ruling. So, of course, God must be monarchical if God is to be simple, right? Then how does Trinitarianism fit into all of this? Well, Tertullian and Hippolytus argue that there is indeed one divine monarchianism, but the rule is not centered in a particular person. It's centered in a shared will that is participated in equally among the three persons of the Trinity. In other words, we considered a monarch to be a single person who sits on the throne and rules. Tertullian and Hippolytus argue that ruling is not so much a matter of a person as it is a matter of power and will. And since all the members of the Trinity share the same power and the same will, then there is one rule of God which exists three times over, which is a Trinitarian formulation. Tertullian especially argued that God is simple. God is one substance, one power, one will, one monarchy. He argued this in about 200 CE or so, and even though lots of debate and development happened between his writing and the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Council of Nicaea more or less adopted Tertullian's formulation of the Trinitarian doctrine. I say that to state that pretty early on, as early as 200, Tertullian is articulating ideas in a specific way that he also inherited that were later formally adopted by the church. So this intuition that the church had very early on continued on despite whatever debates they might have been having. One way of thinking about divine simplicity, though, is to collapse the persons into one. After all, Tertullian argued for one substance, one will, one power, one rule. This sounds an awful lot like just one person. However, the argument that what has been revealed in Scripture and in creation history is that more than one character was involved. After all, the Son appears to be distinct from the Father, the Spirit appears to be distinct from the Son, and so on. So perhaps, it was argued, we can solve the problem by saying that there is one God who exists as one person, but who puts on different masks or adopts different roles in order to do different things. This, of course, is modalism, which is also called Sabellianism. While Sabellianism solves the problem of how God can still be considered simple and yet appear to us in different ways, it creates a new problem about divine suffering. In your other theology courses, you might have learned that God was considered impassible, meaning that God cannot be acted upon by circumstances in such a way that God experiences suffering and pain. The early Trinitarian theologians believed in divine impassibility, and so were threatened by Sabellianism on two fronts. The first one was that of deception. If there was really only one person within the Godhead, then Jesus talking about the Father, the Father addressing the Son at the Transfiguration, the suggestion that Jesus would send the Spirit, it all seems like a ruse. If Father, Son, and Spirit are all being talked about like they're different persons, but they really aren't, then that's deceptive. God, they argued, is not deceptive. And so rather than these being different masks or roles taken on by the same person, the early theologians argued these were actually different persons or energies within the Godhead. The second reason the early theologians rejected Sabellianism was to protect God from suffering. It was clear to them that Jesus suffered on the cross. And if Jesus the Son was identical to the Father, then that meant that the Father suffered on the cross. Because they could not conceive of a suffering God in that way, they had to reject Sabellianism in order to protect the Father from pain and suffering. Instead, they believed it was the Son who suffered, but he suffered in executing the singular divine will that exists among the three persons of the Trinity. The Father, they argued, was untouched by the suffering on the cross, which is only possible if there's a distinction within the Godhead. As an aside, the classical doctrine of impassibility has a strong minority tradition of being questioned within the church from very early on. It wasn't always just fully and wholeheartedly agreed with. In the 20th century, the doctrine of impassibility has come under serious fire, and it remains a very controversial topic and totally worth your time as potential pastoral theologians. But one thing I want to point out is a cultural shift. In ancient times, a God who could suffer was of no comfort. God must be beyond suffering in order to help creation. But that's not necessarily the case in modern times. These days, a God who is beyond suffering can seem distant and aloof and uncaring. Instead, a God who suffers with us and beside us is often considered a caring God. I want to point out that the debate about whether or not God can suffer is very interesting, but it centers around the same fundamental question about redemption, which is, how does God save me from suffering? Does God save me by giving me the divine power of impassibility? Or does God save me by being with me and beside me in my suffering? In my opinion, this is not so much a question at the level of theologica, which is a question about can God suffer, but it's a question at the level of oikonomia. What does it mean for God to be with me and to save me from the horrors of the current reality? Now, I've touched on the three biggest elements that I see operating in Trinitarian doctrine, but there are, of course, more. However, the goal of Trinitarian formulations was to come back over and over again to the idea that we see true distinctness in the agents involved in creation and in salvation history. The distinctness of those persons must be maintained, and yet we understand God to be one. This oneness must be maintained. The early church struggled with how to formulate the balance between persons and oneness, especially in light of their philosophical inheritance about what it meant for something to be divine. As we'll talk about more in the next lecture, the Cappadocians specifically helped develop a language about how we can talk about the one God in terms of substance, but we can talk about the persons of the Trinity in terms of unique expressions, specific energies, or hypostases. This is at times referred to as the genus-species argument. That God is a singular substance or genus in three unique expressions or species. And so I look forward to discussing this more with you next time. Please delve into the Holmes reading and get what you can out of that. Thanks.